Well, Talking Church, I'm so excited to be joined today by Ryan Bangert, who is involved with Alliance Defending Freedom. And he told me his title, and I'll let him share it because I knew I would forget it. But I am excited for this conversation today because I know that if you clicked on this episode or you're listening, you know that we're talking about the Johnson Amendment, what pastors are allowed to share. But Ryan, can you introduce yourself, your role, and why we're having the conversation? And then I have a list of a lot of questions here that I want to get to and help pastors feel equipped to handle this in this election season.
You bet, Logan. It's a pleasure to be on the show. My name is Ryan Bangert. I'm with Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm the Senior Vice President for Strategic Initiatives there. And I think bringing up the Johnson Amendment right now is really timely because every time an election season rolls around, we always get questions from churches and pastors and ministry leaders about what they can and can't say under the Internal Revenue Code. And the Johnson Amendment's been on the books for over half a century and has posed problems for just about that length of time. So we're happy to talk about it here today. I think it's a really important topic.
I think the best starting place would be, what is the Johnson Amendment? I think there's many pastors who are aware of it, who know a lot about its history, and others who probably this is their first time hearing about it. So could you give us maybe an overview of what it is, and then maybe some of the challenges that we have, and of course, then how we can respond to it, we'll get to.
Right. No, the Johnson Amendment was passed back in 1954. So it's been on the books for a long time. It was named for then Texas Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the history of the amendment it's got a somewhat questionable lineage. It was passed in the summer of 1954 during a debate over some tax reforms. And Johnson at that time was involved in a very heated re-election campaign in Texas. And there were two secular nonprofit organizations that were opposing his candidacy. One of them was called the Facts Forum, and the other was called the Committee for Constitutional Governance. And he was really incensed that these nonprofits were opposing his candidacy. So he inserted into the Internal Revenue Code a provision that prohibits 501c3s from engaging in political activity. So that's how it started. And since that time, it's rolled forward and caused a bunch of problems for churches. The tax provision that I think all of your listeners are familiar with, if they're pastors, is 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And that's the provision that governs most churches. In fact, churches are automatically put into 501c3 status if they don't elect a status at all. So it's really the default status for churches. And what the Johnson Amendment said was, if you are a church that's under a 501c3, which all churches are, then you are prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for elective public office. So that's what it is. It's just a little amendment to 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, but it has big implications.
Yeah, and so I think with those implications, there's a lot of interpretations, no doubt. We've talked about this internally to where there seems to be maybe a double standard in how this is enforced. I mean, in terms of the enforcement of this, in my research of it, it seems the enforcement is very little to none. In some of our research, we found maybe there was one church that took an ad out in the newspaper that said, don't vote for Bill Clinton, that got in trouble for it. But for the most part, it seems like this is more of a kind of a threat that's looming versus actual litigation happening. Is that a correct assumption, or is there actually things on the books that are being churches and nonprofits that are continually being brought in and penalized for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the IRS's enforcement of the Johnson Amendment has been very spotty at best. You mentioned the Branch Ministries versus Rosati case. That was the church that took out a full-page ad in a national magazine that opposed the candidacy of Bill Clinton back in 1992. And that was an instance where the IRS did enforce the Johnson Amendment against a ministry that was organized under 501c3. Now, there isn't a lot of reported case law in the reporters on Johnson Amendment, but the IRS does issue enforcement letters. It does conduct investigations. It does impose penalties on churches much more frequently. In fact, just recently, there was an instance where a church out in Leesburg, Virginia, a very large church, Cornerstone Church, had to pay a penalty because the pastor preached a message comparing the Republican and the Democrat platforms during a church service and compared them against biblical standards on hotly contested issues. And he noted that the Republican platform was more consistent with biblical standards. And for that, he received a letter from the IRS and ended up having to pay a fine. Now, we believe that was completely unconstitutional on the part of the IRS, but that's an example of how they can enforce the Johnson Amendment without filing a lawsuit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for many that's news to them. Again, it was news to me. You talk about this unconstitutionality of this. Can you maybe explain some of your kind of basis and convictions at ADF as to why you believe that this is? And again, I have more questions around that, but you mentioned that, and I think again, as any good cross examination or alternative side would say, well, what is your defense of why you believe it's unconstitutional versus just being a claim that you say?
No, that's a great question. And for a long time, scholars have looked at the Johnson Amendment and made arguments on both sides. But I think if you ask an honest constitutional lawyer what they think about the Johnson Amendment, it's very difficult to argue that it's constitutional under the First Amendment, especially. And why is that? Because the Johnson Amendment specifically targets specific kinds of speakers, 501c3s, which encompasses churches, and it specifically targets specific kinds of messages, speech relating to elections of candidates for public office. That's a classic content-based and speaker-based restriction on speech, which in most instances, the Supreme Court would condemn under the First Amendment. Beyond that, we also believe it violates the free exercise to the Constitution as well as the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And why is that? Because many churches believe that they have a moral and biblical obligation to speak to moral issues of the day from a biblical perspective. Take the issue of abortion, or take a very hot issue right now, which is the question of treating minors who want to engage in procedures to change their bodies consistent with what they believe their gender identity is. And these are issues that the Bible speaks clearly to. And many pastors believe it is their moral and biblical obligation to speak to those issues. And the Johnson Amendment, even though it speaks in terms of elected candidates for elected office, it also includes some vague terms that in some instances could cause pastors to believe, and in some cases could encompass speech about issues, even if you don't mention a candidate by name. And so that's where we believe the Johnson Amendment is particularly problematic, because it's so vague and so expansive that it could chill or prevent pastors from speaking about issues, even if they're not endorsing or opposing a candidate by name, that have clear biblical implications.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating to me, and again, it's springing up many more questions. I think in the case of the Johnson Amendment, maybe some argument on the positive side of what it could do to help churches is, I do think from a Christian perspective, there is no candidate that is perfect candidate. Jesus is not on the ballot, and of course, as there's many pastors that are listening, I don't know any pastor, again, maybe some are accused, that says, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris is the way to heaven, right? It's Jesus is the way to heaven. However, I do think that there probably is some wisdom in not putting all of our chips in one basket, as we say. However, I see the problems seem to vastly outweigh maybe the positives. And one of the questions that I have on response to you mentioned specifically targeting 501c3s. I have a kind of a rabbit trail here, if you're willing to follow it with me. Would a CEO of a company who's speaking, let's say General Motors, would he be able to endorse a political candidate?
Well, the Citizens United case that the U.S. Supreme Court decided, there's really no problem at all, I think, with the CEO of a for-profit company. Now, they may have issues with their board of directors, and they may have corporate governance issues that would preclude it, but there's really no prohibition on a CEO in their own individual capacity endorsing a candidate for elected office.
Because I think where I'm going with this is, if a pastor is unable to communicate from their church's position, who many churches, never receive any federal funding or anything, yet a company like General Motors, who gets bailed out by the government, who gets hundreds of millions or billions of dollars from the government, is able to put their weight behind a platform or put, candidates involved in this. And again, I know there's probably some more nuances that I don't know, but it does seem a bit inconsistent, which is what we felt and I think actually we contacted ADF early in COVID, is we felt that the governor was inconsistently applying the rules to punish churches to where he allowed 50 in bars, but only 25 at a church service, where we said that's inconsistent to allow that different. Is that some of your kind of thought process and precedent to you're inconsistently applying this to punish only people that maybe might benefit a certain side or predominantly?
There's some pretty good evidence that the IRS has inconsistently applied the Johnson Amendment. In fact, the lawsuit was filed just this summer in the Eastern District of Texas, out in Tyler, Texas, basically alleging that the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional. And in that lawsuit, there are paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of allegations showing how the IRS has refused to enforce the Johnson Amendment against certain entities that are controlled or owned by 501c3s, including newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer and Mother Jones Magazine, and also pointing to a number of churches that have historically brought in candidates for political office to their church sermons, and the pastors have issued what effectively amount to endorsements of those candidates. But generally speaking, they've all been on one particular side of the political aisle. The IRS has never enforced against them. And so there is a real problem here with what we call selective enforcement by the Internal Revenue Service of the Johnson Amendment. And that's a real problem. And that's also a First Amendment problem of selective enforcement.
Well, you mentioned the Leesburg case with Cornerstone. I mean, I remember, again, I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I remember a clip on social media where I think it was Pastor Creflo Dollar in Georgia said, with Stacey Abrams in the room, and he had her stand, and he said, the next governor of Georgia, and then he said, you know what to do, to his congregation. And so if in the Johnson Amendment it's explicit and implicit, then I would think that would be explicit almost, or at minimum implicit. Now, I don't know, maybe behind the scenes he was fined for it. I doubt it. But it does seem to be, there are a lot of pastors, and again, typically the conservative ones that are reaching out to us that are saying, I feel like I don't want to pay this fine. But in the same way, if this is unconstitutional, I want to share this. And again, no one is saying a candidate is perfect or a candidate is God, or even that candidates are Christian. That's between them and the Lord. But one that maybe does align better with the beliefs that we stand for. And I would hope that those on the left as well would want this too, to say, no, we want to not be selectively identified. And again, there's other 501c3s that are not Christian that might be, other religions, or just like you mentioned, these newspapers that they say, we don't want to get fined because we're sharing our First Amendment rights. That selective application, no doubt, seems pretty dangerous.
I could hardly agree more. And to something you said earlier, some of the good counter arguments against repealing the Johnson Amendment are arguments that, well, the church shouldn't be in the business of endorsing candidates. Candidates are imperfect vehicles. Certainly, no human being is a path to salvation. And of course, as a Christian, I completely agree with that. I think the question, though, with the Johnson Amendment is who should be making the decision for the church as to what it says and doesn't say about these contested political issues, these contested moral issues, and even political elections. We believe that's a decision that should be made by individual pastors and their congregations, whether they're on the left, the right, the center, or anywhere in between. That's a decision that those pastors and those congregations and their boards should be making. And the problem that you have when the government puts itself in the position of determining what can and cannot be said in a pastor's sermon is you end up with these situations where there's selective enforcement, uneven enforcement, where pastors don't know how far they can go in terms of doing what they believe is their biblical duty. And that's a real problem under the First Amendment. We're not saying that pastors should feel an obligation to endorse political candidates. Far from it. What we're simply saying is pastors should have the liberty and the freedom to make those decisions for themselves according to their conscience and biblical standards. And that is not the government's role to impose itself on churches, on pastors, to dictate what their sermons can and cannot say about issues that are clearly of interest to their congregation and issues that very frequently have a biblical valence.
No doubt. We've been using the terminology kind of pastor and church in somewhat synonymously, but I am curious in a personal capacity. We mentioned the General Motors kind of example. I agree 100%. I think it should be the elder boards, the pastoral staff, the congregation members, the deacons, that they say, no, as a church, we feel this is what we want to do. And those that don't align with that position, maybe they go be a part of another church. But in the case of a personal platform, I mean, I've seen pastors, and I help my dad, who's our lead pastor, with this and trying to discern, what is your personal Twitter account? What is your social media? Is that a representative of the church? Is that a personal platform? Because we're a part of a 501c3, does that make our First Amendment rights as an individual go away? Can you maybe talk about how we can process some of those things and how you've advised pastors who come to you?
Right. I mean, that's one of the great problems with the Johnson Amendment, because you are absolutely correct that individual citizens do not surrender their First Amendment rights simply because they happen to hold a position with a 501c3 organization, including being a pastor. So pastors do have a constitutional right to speak in their personal capacities on issues that are political or otherwise. Now, the question becomes, as a head pastor of a church, when are you speaking in your personal capacity, or when are you speaking in your official capacity as the pastor on behalf of the church as the church? And the IRS really doesn't give exceptionally clear of a guidance on that, apart from saying, well, we'll consider all the facts and circumstances to evaluate whether or not this constitutes a violation. Now, certainly we can give advice as to how to ensure, to the greatest extent possible, that a communication made by a pastor is in their personal capacity. Such things as don't use church resources. Don't, if you're going to make a personal capacity statement, then don't put it in the church bulletin. Don't say it from the stage during a church sermon. Don't put it up on the church website. Use your own personal Twitter account. Use your own personal Instagram or social media account. And if you're using that account to also conduct church business, well, then that becomes an even more complicated analysis. So there are a variety of different factors that go into it. And I think you can see from this that this only points up even greater, to a greater extent, I think, the problems of the Johnson Amendment. It forces pastors to make these judgment calls, when in our view, they shouldn't have to do that at all.
Yeah. I mean, again, even in this short conversation, I think we're already getting to many of the challenges and problems that are no doubt can be paralyzing for pastors to feel like, I'm just going to not talk about it at all. But I would say since COVID, particularly, maybe even 2016 and before, but social media as it's grown, I do think there are more pastors that feel a sense of obligation to, my congregation is no longer just the people that are in my church on a Sunday. These are people that are watching on social media that are, again, maybe not there every single week, but they're paying attention. That pastors have been given a greater way to amplify their voice, just as every other area of commerce and organizations and other religions have as well. And again, it just does seem to be, again, so much unfair. I think that we're talking a lot about the election, as of course it's coming up here just in a few weeks. As Can you have a candidate come speak at your church? I feel like there have been some things that I've heard. Again, I don't know if there's any truth to them, but it's, if you invite people on both sides, you can do this. Is that just a urban legend, or is that a truth to that? Does that come from the Johnson Amendment, or is that a separate thing?
That's Internal Revenue Service guidance. It's not an urban legend. It's actually true. You can invite a candidate for public office to speak at your church, but you have to provide all the candidates for that particular office with an equal opportunity. And so my old church back in Plano, Texas, used to have candidate forums where they would invite candidates. They would extend invitations equally to all of the candidates to participate in a particular event. Now, the question, though, is it an equal opportunity? For instance, if you invite candidate A to the main morning service where you have several thousand attendees, and then candidate B to a potluck dinner on a Tuesday night where you have 50 attendees, that's not an equal opportunity. And again, this falls under the facts and circumstances test that the IRS uses. And so to answer your question, yes, you can have candidates attend, and you can even have them speak, but you have to provide an equal opportunity for all.
And when you're using the term candidates here, let's say it's somebody who's not in our district. I think of, maybe it's a senator that's from a different state or something that we want to come speak to our church because they think that they align with our Christian values and our Christian beliefs. I have a few people in mind that we've actually talked to about inviting to come. Does that still align even though they're not within the jurisdiction? Is that a gray area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And the IRS doesn't provide any kind of guidance about whether or not it has to be a candidate who your particular church members are or are not going to be voting for. Now, it's obvious that in today's world, many times churches will simulcast or broadcast their services all across the country. And so it could have an effect just about anywhere these days.
Mhm.
And so, no, there's nothing in the guidance that would necessarily limit it to a candidate who just happens to be running from your particular district or covered by your jurisdiction.
Another question I have is, I believe in the language of the Johnson Amendment, it was opposing or promoting, or maybe you can clarify that language. But
Sure.
my question goes along with opposing versus voicing our displeasure. Because I believe even if I am for somebody and I've voted for somebody, I can have displeasure in the way that they're leading. I think that's one of the greatest, rights that we have as citizens, is that we get a voice in sharing our displeasure with our politicians and our elected leaders. I think that's what makes us the freest country in the world. I think I can't remember who said it, but they said, if you want to know who has the power, ask yourself, who can't you criticize? And I think that that's one of the things that has made our country so great, is that we, as much as we can respect the office of our leaders, whether it's President Trump or President Harris, I can voice my displeasure with them with my First Amendment right. I think as a church as well, we can say, hey, no, stand up for life, stand up for these types of things. Well, when does it start to become opposition? And unfortunately, I think the answer you may give me is that's lack of clarity as well. But I'm trying to help pastors to say, if we're not able to even voice our displeasure, even if it's a candidate we voted for, it seems to point out another big problem.
It does. And again, as you suspected, this again falls under the facts and circumstances test that the Internal Revenue Service imposes. The rule that's in place is that churches, 501c3s, under the Johnson Amendment, are prohibited from directly or indirectly, and the word indirectly is always the problematic one there, participating in or intervening in a political campaign. And that includes, quote, making public statements of position, verbal or written, on behalf of the organization in favor of or opposition to a candidate for public office. So if you make a formal statement of opposition, let's say a candidate is running for president, and from the pulpit you say, you should vote against candidate A. Well, that pretty clearly, under the Internal Revenue Service's interpretation, constitutes a statement against a candidate. But what if you just criticize the candidate's record? What if you say, this candidate has implemented policies or taken positions that we believe are unbiblical? Well, then you fall into that sort of indirectly test, and that's the facts and circumstances test. And the IRS would look at things like, does the statement inherently favor one candidate over another? Does it necessarily send a message of support or opposition concerning a candidate? And again, these are very murky tests, but that's where we find ourselves with the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah, when I was coming into this conversation, I had my questions about the Johnson Amendment and its validity, and in just 20 minutes here already, you've built the case, at least for myself, to feel even worse about it. And I stand with you to feel the unconstitutionality of it, not only for its effect on our First Amendment rights, but even just for its lack of effectiveness and clarity. I think any law, if it's, well, we would consider that theft if maybe someone thought you stole it, and if we think your intent, it starts to get very subjective, which I think is absolutely the opposite of the intent of a law, is to be as objective as we can be. So again, already I think there's many people hopefully that are nodding their heads and agreeing this. A couple more questions here before we wrap up, and then I do want to give you an opportunity to add anything for pastors who are maybe curious or have maybe their own situation that ADF could help with. But what should we be confident in? And again, you mentioned there's not a ton of case law, but how should pastors, from my interpretation of what we talked about, they might come after you for any of these things. And I don't want people leaving this conversation actually being more afraid and more less equipped to handle the issues as the next few weeks are with the election. Maybe people are watching this later and there's an election coming up, or even if it's not an election year and they're just wondering, can I speak out about this law that is unjust, or this candidate that is promoting things that are unbiblical that my congregation is asking me about?
That's a great question, Logan. And we certainly don't want to instill a spirit of fear in pastors around speaking out on biblical issues, on issues of truth and falsehood of morality that are clearly implicated by Scripture. And the Johnson Amendment, we believe, rightly interpreted, does not do that. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's no prohibition on pastors talking about issues, statutes, laws that directly implicate biblical truth. Take a great example, abortion. Abortion is an issue that's hotly contested right now in the election. There is nothing in the Johnson Amendment that would prohibit a pastor from taking the stage and preaching a sermon on what the Bible says about abortion. There's nothing in the Johnson Amendment that would prohibit a pastor from taking the stage and preaching in a sermon what the Bible says about gender ideology, what the Bible says about immigration, what the Bible says about taxation. There's nothing in the Johnson Amendment that would prohibit a pastor from speaking to the issues of the day from a biblical lens. Where pastors tend to get into trouble is when they begin mentioning candidates by name and implying strongly or stating expressly that the congregation should vote for or against a specific candidate. The closer you walk to the line of talking about specific candidates, the more that you run into potential trouble with the Johnson Amendment. But when you're talking about issues specifically, I think there's a very good argument that the Johnson Amendment does not touch that at all, nor should it touch that, because that is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And pastors have every right to speak out, even in their official capacity as pastors, on the issues of the day as they relate to biblical truth. So I would encourage pastors to be very courageous in this. I've seen many pastors do it, and I think it's something that pastors should give real consideration to, because this is the problem that we have with the Johnson Amendment writ large, which is it chills pastors. It makes pastors afraid to speak truth, critical truth, on issues that are affecting their congregation in the moment. People are wondering right now, what do I think about abortion? Because it's being talked about constantly in the airwaves. Pastors have every right and even an obligation to speak truth to that issue. And the Johnson Amendment does not prevent them from doing so.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I appreciate your adding some weight to this. From, of course, an opinion of mine is not as well researched as yours, and I appreciate all the work that you guys do. I think on the personal side of things as well, and again, this was just one last question that I had that I don't know if there, again, I feel like the answer continues to be, it's so vague, it's so vague, it's so vague. But when it comes to pastors' spouses, pastors' children, these are not people that are official capacity of the church. But I do find that there are, in the church, we kind of feel, no, they're all part of this. But maybe in the eyes of the government, they're not. Maybe this is an opportunity that a pastor's spouse could say, no, I don't have an official job. And of course, some pastors' spouses are not, or they are on staff, which of course is a little bit different. But there's others like my wife, she's not on staff at the church. Is that something where it's, hey, that's an opportunity for you as a pastor to, maybe you can get your family's voice heard, even if it's not in your own personal capacity. And I'm not trying to cheat the system, but in some ways, I'm also just trying to say, I think it's already unfair being applied. Well, let's at least be wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove, right?
Absolutely. And again, to be clear, pastors absolutely can speak in their own personal capacity,
right?
On candidates. They can talk about candidates. They can endorse a candidate for elective office in their own personal capacity, not on behalf of the church. And many, many pastors do this and do it without any problem. And of course, if a pastor has a family member who's not on staff at the church, I sure wouldn't want to be the Internal Revenue agent who brought that case, because I think the court would pour you out pretty fast.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that clarification on the personal capacity. I think those who have maybe a muddy voice that seems to blend through, maybe there are tools. And if you have any advice for pastors who can separate those, I think for us as a church, and again, this is just for those listening, is what we've tried to do, is we do a lot of co-sharing with Pastor Rob. Anything that does seem to insinuate that it is a personal platform or a personal thing, we will not co-share with the church. We'll do as his own platforms. On Twitter,
right,
we try to include, opinions are Pastor Rob's or our Rob Ketterling's opinions, not affiliated officially with the church. Now, will people go through the tweets and say, "Ha ha, you talked about the church here"? I find it so difficult for a pastor who their heart and soul and their life is into their congregation. They're shepherds, they're people.
Mhm.
In many ways, we don't separate our personal life and our private or our professional life. It's kind of baked in, and so maybe there are opportunities for us to at least delineate this when it comes to communication that maybe wouldn't be normal for pastors to do, but in this case might be necessary.
Yeah, there are definitely good practices and best practices that can be implemented there with respect to personal social media accounts. And at ADF, we have a group called the Church and Ministry Alliance that serves churches all across the country. And we provide advice, in depth advice, specifically tailored to your individual situation on issues just like this. We will help you figure out exactly how you can speak in a voice that's unique and your own as a pastor. That's not going to put your church in any jeopardy with the Johnson Amendment or otherwise. We can help you. We can guide you through the analysis when it comes to what can your church say and not say in a sermon, for instance, on a Sunday morning, consistent with the Johnson Amendment. These are all things that we do on a day-to-day basis through our Church and Ministry Alliance. If you go to adflegal.org, you can find more resources there. And we are all. It's always our pleasure to work with churches all across the country, like I said, on these issues because it's something that it's really unfortunate that the government has put this vague roadblock in the way of pastors fulfilling what they believe is their biblical duty to speak truth to the current moment.
Awesome. Well, I encourage our listeners to take advantage of that resource. And is there anything else that maybe I missed a question I should have asked, or anything you have in your notes that you felt was worthwhile to share? I know you shared so much already, and even in this kind of short time here, there's a lot to unpack and go back and listen to. But I do want to give you an opportunity if there's anything else that you wanted to mention to all the pastors, church leaders, elders, deacons that are listening, who just want to be biblically strong and stand up for what they believe in, but also maybe don't want to pay the fine if they don't have to, because maybe the other question is there anything we can do to maybe get this thrown out, or is that we're beyond that at this
Yeah.
point?
We're not beyond that. In fact, I think there's every chance that this amendment could be struck down in the First Amendment. There's a lawsuit pending right now in federal court asking the courts to do just that. And so this law is very much, I think, subject to question under the First Amendment. But I would just encourage your listeners, pastors, don't be afraid. Don't walk in a spirit of fear on these issues because there is clear guidance that we can give. I mean, obviously, the law can be very vague and ambiguous, but we can give you clear guideposts that will help steer you in the right direction. Don't be afraid about speaking out on the issues of the day. We mentioned that earlier. Don't be afraid of giving your congregations biblical spiritual truth on these important issues, even if they're part of a political campaign, because there are ways to navigate that will steer clear of the rocky shoals of the Johnson Amendment. So please, please, please don't silence yourself. Don't chill your speech. Don't decline to speak up on something you believe the Lord is leading you to say that your congregation needs to hear simply because you're afraid of the Johnson Amendment. There's help there, is help available, and we can tell you on good authority that there are ways to navigate this that will keep your church safe, but will allow you at the same time to speak biblical truth to an age that desperately needs it.
Well, what a close, a great finish. And I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the many pastors that will listen to this, no doubt, this election and the elections up to come. Want to encourage those to check out adflegal.org and just all the opportunities ahead of them that we can stand for truth no matter what comes our way. And again, just thank you, Ryan, for speaking to us today. And I hope we get the chance to chat soon. And hopefully it's not related to a legal issue that I have.
Hopefully not. And we just pray God's blessings over you, Logan, your pastor, your church, and all the pastors who are listening. I mean, it's such important work that you're doing. There's a lot of spiritual warfare right now. So it's just our prayer that God strengthens you, that he equips you, that he blesses the work that you're doing and keeps you and your family safe in this election season.
Thank you.